The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as thousands of tourists gathered for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old teacher from Ohio, clutching her camera with trembling hands. This wasn't just any ordinary vacation for her. She had traveled across the Atlantic Ocean carrying a burden that had weighed on her heart for over 2 decades. Sarah, quote, "S eyes scanned the sea of red uniforms and towering, black bearskin hats as the guards took their positions. Each guard stood perfectly still, like statues carved from stone, their faces hidden beneath the shadow of their ceremonial headwear. The tourists around her chattered excitedly, snapping photos and pointing at the magnificent display of British tradition. But Sarah wasn't looking for the perfect photograph or the best angle for a selfie. She was searching for something far more precious. 20-3 years ago, Sarah had been just 11 years old when her family visited London during a difficult time in her life. Her father, Sergeant Michael Mitchell, had recently returned from military service, bearing both visible and invisible wounds from his deployment. The family trip was meant to be a healing journey, a way to reconnect and create new memories together. During that visit, they had witnessed the same ceremony Sarah was now watching, and something extraordinary had happened that changed her young life forever. As Sarah remembered that day long ago, tears began to well up in her eyes. Her father had been struggling with what doctors now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Though back then, few people understood the invisible battle that many veterans fought daily. He had become distant and quiet, a shadow of the jovial man who used to lift her high in the air and spin her around the living room. The family had hoped that the trip to England, exploring castles and experiencing history, might help bring him back to them. Standing in the same spot where she had stood as a child, Sarah could almost hear her younger self asking her father questions about the guards. "Daddy, why don't they move? Don't they get tired? Are they real soldiers like you?" Her father had explained the discipline and dedication required to serve as a Queen's Guard, his voice filled with respect for their commitment and service. It was one of the few times during that trip when she had seen a spark of his old self return. The crowd around Sarah began to quiet as the ceremony commenced. The precision and pageantry of the guards' movements commanded respect and attention. Each step was measured, each turn executed with military precision that spoke of countless hours of training and dedication. Sarah watched, but her mind continued to drift back to that day when she was 11, remembering how her father's posture had straightened as he watched the guards, as if their discipline and honor had somehow reminded him of his own worth and service. What happened next during that childhood visit had remained vivid in Sarah's memory all these years. As the ceremony had concluded and the crowds began to disperse, young Sarah had noticed one of the guards standing alone near the castle entrance. Unlike the others who had moved to their next positions, this guard remained statue still, but something about his posture seemed different. Even at 11 years old, Sarah had possessed an unusual ability to sense when someone was in pain. Without thinking, and before her parents could stop her, Sarah had approached the guard. She couldn't see his face clearly beneath the large bearskin hat, but something about him reminded her of her father. Perhaps it was the way he held his shoulders, or the slight tremor she noticed in his hands that he tried to hide. In that moment, young Sarah had done something that shocked everyone around her, including her own family. She had stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around the guard's waist in a gentle hug. The tourists nearby had gasped. Royal Guards were known for their unwavering stoicism and strict protocol. They never broke character, never acknowledged the public, and certainly never engaged in personal interactions while on duty. Sarah's parents had rushed forward, mortified by their daughter's breach of protocol, ready to apologize profusely for the disruption. But what happened next had left everyone present completely speechless and had shaped Sarah's understanding of human connection and compassion for the rest of her life. The memory of the guard's response had sustained her through her own difficult times, influenced her decision to become a teacher, and ultimately brought her back to this very spot. 23 years later. Now, as an adult, Sarah understood so much more about that moment. She had learned about the rigorous training and discipline required to serve as a royal guard, the physical and mental challenges they faced, and the personal sacrifices they made in service to their country. She had also learned more about her father's struggles and had gained a deeper appreciation for the invisible battles that many people fight every day. Sarah had become a teacher, partly because of what she had witnessed that day. She had dedicated her career to working with children who, like her younger self, possessed an intuitive ability to sense when others were in pain. She taught them about compassion, empathy, and the power of simple human gestures to bridge the gaps that often separate us from one another. Standing in the courtyard now, watching a new generation of guards perform their duties with the same precision and dedication she had witnessed decades earlier, Sarah felt the weight of her mission. She had returned to London not just as a tourist, but as someone seeking to complete a circle that had begun when she was 11 years old. In her purse she carried a letter that she had written and rewritten dozens of times, along with a photograph from that day 23 years ago. The ceremony was beginning to wind down, and Sarah knew that soon she would have to find the courage to approach one of the guards again. But this time she wouldn't be offering a spontaneous hug from a child who didn't understand protocol. This time, she was carrying a message of gratitude and a story of how one moment of unexpected human connection had rippled through the years to touch countless other lives. The guard Sarah had hugged 23 years ago was named James Thompson, though she would never learn his name until much later. At 25 years old, James had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 3 years, following a family tradition that stretched back generations. His grandfather had served during World War II, his father had been a guardsman in the 1970s, and James had always known that he would follow in their footsteps. But on that particular day in 2000, James was facing the most challenging period of his military career. Just 2 weeks earlier, he had received news that his younger brother David, who was serving with the British Army in Northern Ireland, had been seriously injured in a training accident. David was lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life, and James felt helpless being unable to be by his side due to his ceremonial duties. The rigid discipline that made James an exemplary guardsman also meant that he couldn't show his emotional turmoil while on duty. Day after day, he stood motionless for hours, his face hidden beneath the iconic bearskin hat, while his mind raced with worry about his brother. The other guards in his unit knew about his situation, but the nature of their service meant that personal problems had to be set aside when they were representing the Crown. That morning, as James took his position for the ceremony, he had received an update from his mother. David's condition had worsened overnight, and the doctors weren't sure if he would pull through. James felt his world crumbling around him, but his training kicked in. He stood at attention, his rifle held precisely, his posture perfect, even as his heart was breaking inside. The ceremony proceeded as it always did, with tourists watching in fascination and cameras clicking constantly. James had performed this routine hundreds of times, but today every minute felt like an hour. He was counting down the moments until he could be relieved of duty, and perhaps find a way to get permission to visit his brother. As the main ceremony concluded, James moved to his assigned position near the castle entrance for the final portion of his duty. This was typically the most challenging part, as curious tourists often tried to get reactions from the guards, taking photos just inches from their faces or making jokes to see if they could break the stoic facade. Today, James felt particularly vulnerable, worried that his emotional state might show despite his training. That quote when he noticed the American family approaching. The father, a man who carried himself with the bearing of someone who had served in the military, was explaining something to his young daughter about the guards and their service. James could see the respect in the man's eyes, the kind of recognition that one service member gives to another. But it was the little girl who caught James's attention. She was perhaps 11 years old, with curious eyes that seemed to see more than most adults. As her parents talked, she studied James with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. It wasn't the typical tourist fascination with the uniform and ceremony. There was something deeper in her gaze, as if she was looking past the bearskin hat and red tunic to see the person underneath. Then, without warning, the little girl stepped forward. James's training had prepared him for many situations, But nothing had prepared him for what happened next. The child wrapped her small arms around his waist in a gentle, innocent embrace. The action was so unexpected, so pure in its intention, that for a moment James forgot where he was and what his duties required. In that instant, several things happened simultaneously. The tourists around them gasped and began reaching for their cameras. Sarah's parents rushed forward, clearly mortified by their daughter's breach of protocol. A senior guard nearby started to move forward to intervene. According to every rule and regulation James had learned, he should have remained perfectly still, ignoring the interaction completely until it ended. But in that moment, James felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks. The innocent warmth of the child's embrace, given freely and without expectation, reminded him of the reason he had chosen to serve in the first place. It wasn't about the rigid protocol or the tourist spectacle. It was about protecting and serving people, about being part of something larger than himself that included moments of genuine human connection. What James did next violated every rule in the guardsman's handbook, but it felt like the most important thing he had ever done in uniform. Instead of remaining motionless, he looked down at the little girl who was still hugging him. Then, very carefully and gently, he placed his white-gloved hand on her head in a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and profound. The gasps turned to murmurs of amazement. Cameras that had been raised to capture what they expected to be an awkward moment of rule-breaking instead documented something beautiful and unprecedented. Even Sarah's parents, who had been rushing forward to collect their daughter, stopped in their tracks. But James wasn't finished. In a voice so soft that only Sarah could hear, he whispered 2 words that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Thank you." Then, as protocol demanded, James returned to his position of attention, his hand back at his side, his face once again hidden in shadow. But something fundamental had changed. The weight that had been pressing down on him all morning had lifted, slightly. The simple, genuine gesture of compassion from a child had reminded him that even in the midst of personal crisis, there were still moments of light and connection to be found. Sarah stepped back to her parents, but she continued to look at the guard with new understanding. Even at 11 years old, she sensed that something important had just happened, though she wouldn't fully comprehend its significance until years later. Her father, the veteran, had tears in his eyes as he placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. The senior guard who had been approaching to intervene had also stopped, recognizing that what he had just witnessed transcended normal protocol. In his 20 years of service, he had never seen anything quite like it. The moment had been so genuine, so human, that to interfere would have diminished something precious. As the crowd slowly dispersed, many people carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed. Some had captured it on camera, others simply held it in their hearts. But for James, the moment marked a turning point. Later that day, when he was finally off duty, he would learn that his brother David had begun to show signs of improvement. The doctors couldn't explain the sudden change, but David had opened his eyes for the first time in days. Word of the extraordinary moment between James Thompson and young Sarah Mitchell spread far beyond the castle walls that day. Several tourists had captured the interaction on their cameras, and by evening, the photos and videos were being shared across early internet forums and email chains. The images showed a moment that seemed to transcend the formal barriers of royal protocol, capturing something deeply human and touching. The story reached the local British newspapers within days. Young American girl melts guard's heart, read one headline. A hug that broke protocol and won hearts, declared another. The photos accompanying these articles showed the exact moment when James had placed his hand on Sarah's head, his gesture of acknowledgement visible even beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. But the media attention, while mostly positive, created complications for James. Royal guards are expected to maintain absolute professionalism and anonymity while on duty. Breaking protocol, even for the most heartwarming reasons, typically resulted in disciplinary action. James found himself called before his commanding officers to explain his actions. Colonel William Harrison, the officer in charge of the Queen's Guard detail, was a man who had served for over 30 years. He had seen guards dismissed for far less significant breaches of protocol. As James stood at attention in the colonel's office, he prepared himself for the worst possible outcome. His military career, the family tradition he had worked so hard to uphold, might be ending because of a moment of human compassion. "Guardsman Thompson," Colonel Harrison began, his voice stern and official, "you are aware that your actions yesterday violated several regulations regarding interaction with the public while on ceremonial duty." "Yes, sir," James replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. The colonel studied the photographs that had been published in the newspapers, scattered across his desk. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. James waited for the punishment that he was certain would come. Then Colonel Harrison did something unexpected. He looked up from the photographs and asked, "Guardsman Thompson, can you explain to me what you were thinking in that moment?" James had prepared for many possible questions, but not this one. He took a breath and spoke from his heart. "Sir, I know I broke protocol. There's no excuse for that. But in that moment I saw something in that little girl that reminded me why I chose to serve. She didn't hug me because of the uniform or the ceremony. She hugged me because she sensed that I needed it. And sir, she was right. I did need it." James went on to explain about his brother David's condition, about the weeks of worry and helplessness he had been carrying while trying to maintain his duties. He described how the child's innocent gesture had somehow given him strength at a moment when he felt he had none left to give. Colonel Harrison listened without interruption. When James finished, the room fell silent again. Finally, the colonel stood and walked to the window that overlooked the courtyard where the incident had taken place. "In 33 years of service," the colonel said slowly, "I have seen guards face many challenges. Weather, crowds, personal problems, family crises. The mark of a good guardsman is not that he feels nothing, but that he serves with honor despite what he feels. Yesterday, Guardsman Thompson, you served with honor." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Instead of a court-martial or dismissal, his commanding officer was commending his actions. Colonel Harrison turned back to face James. "The photographs in these newspapers don't show a guard-breaking protocol. They show a representative of the British military acknowledging the compassion of a child with the dignity and grace that our service demands. You didn't abandon your post or forget your duties. You simply recognized a moment of genuine human connection." The colonel picked up one of the photographs, studying it more closely. "I've received calls from members of parliament, from veterans organizations, and from ordinary citizens, all of them praising what they saw in this image. They see what I see, Guardsman Thompson. They see the best of what military service can be." But Colonel Harrison's next words carried a note of caution. "However, this cannot become a precedent. The protocols exist for important reasons. What happened yesterday was extraordinary, and extraordinary moments sometimes require extraordinary responses. But they remain exceptions, not new rules." James nodded, understanding completely. "Yes, sir, I understand." "There will be no disciplinary action," the colonel continued. "Instead, I'm recommending you for commendation. Your conduct under personal stress, your ability to maintain your duties while dealing with family crisis, and your grace in handling an unexpected situation reflect the highest standards of our service." As James left the colonel's office, he felt a mix of relief and continued worry about his brother. But he also felt something else, something that the little American girl had given him and that his commanding officer had now reinforced. He felt proud of his service in a way that went beyond tradition and family expectation. Later that day, James received the news he had been praying for. David had not only stabilized, but was showing remarkable improvement. The doctors were optimistic about his recovery. While James knew there was no logical connection between the child's hug and his brother's improvement, he couldn't help but feel that somehow, that moment of unexpected grace had changed everything. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, Sarah Mitchell had returned to her normal life as a sixth grader. Her parents had told her about the newspaper articles and the attention her spontaneous act of kindness had received. But for Sarah, the moment hadn't been about breaking rules or creating news. It had been about recognizing someone who needed comfort and offering what she could. Sarah, quote, S. father, Sergeant Michael Mitchell, had been profoundly affected by witnessing his daughter's interaction with the guard. Seeing the respect and gentleness with which the guardsman had acknowledged Sarah's gesture had somehow helped him understand his own worth and the honor inherent in military service. The trip that was meant to help him heal had accomplished exactly that, largely because of his daughter's intuitive compassion. In the years that followed, both James and Sarah would carry the memory of that day with them. For James, it became a reminder that military service at its best was about protecting and acknowledging the goodness in ordinary people. For Sarah, it became the foundation of a life philosophy centered on the belief that small acts of kindness could have profound impacts on others. Neither of them knew that their paths would cross again 23 years later, when Sarah would return to London carrying a letter of gratitude and a desire to close the circle that had opened when she was 11 years old. As the changing of the guard ceremony concluded in 2023, Sarah Mitchell took a deep breath and began walking toward the castle entrance where individual guards were positioned for the final portion of their duties. Her heart was racing with the same nervous energy she had felt as a child, but now it was mixed with the weight of adult understanding and purpose. 23 years had passed since her spontaneous embrace had created such an unexpected moment. In those intervening years, Sarah had built a career as an elementary school teacher, specializing in working with children who had experienced trauma or loss. Her classroom walls were decorated with photos from around the world, including a framed copy of the newspaper clipping from that day at Windsor Castle, which served as a daily reminder of the power of simple human connection. Sarah had married her college sweetheart, David, and they had 2 children of their own now. Her father, Michael, had eventually overcome his struggles with post-traumatic stress, and he often credited that trip to London as the beginning of his healing journey. He had passed away 3 years earlier, but not before telling Sarah how proud he was of the compassionate woman she had become. It was her father's passing that had ultimately brought Sarah back to London. While going through his belongings, she had found a journal he had kept during their 2000 trip. In it, he had written extensively about the moment at the castle, describing how watching the guard's gentle response to his daughter's hug had reminded him of his own capacity for tenderness and connection, qualities he had feared he had lost forever. Now, approaching the guards at their posts, Sarah felt the presence of her father's memory giving her courage. She had researched extensively before this trip, trying to understand the proper way to approach a guard on duty. She knew she couldn't simply repeat her childhood action. Instead, she had prepared something different, something that honored both the protocols she now understood and the gratitude she wanted to express. The guard she approached was standing near the same entrance where her encounter had taken place decades earlier. He was younger than James had been, probably in his early 20s, with the same perfect posture and hidden face that characterized all the Queen's guards. Sarah positioned herself respectfully at a distance and waited. After a few minutes, she spoke in a voice just loud enough for the guard to hear. "Excuse me, sir. I know you cannot respond while on duty, but I wanted to share something with you about the honor and dignity of your service." The guard, whose name was Thomas Bennett, remained perfectly still as his training demanded. But like all guards, he was trained to be aware of everything happening around him. He could hear the genuine respect in the woman's voice, and something about her tone made him listen more intently. Sarah continued, 23 years ago, I was an 11-year-old girl who did something I probably shouldn't have done. I hugged one of your fellow guardsmen at this very spot. What happened next taught me something about courage, compassion, and service that has guided my entire life. Thomas had heard stories about the famous hug incident from the older guards. It had become something of a legend among the regiment, a story that was passed down as an example of how to handle unexpected situations with grace and dignity. He had never expected to meet the person who had been at the center of that story. Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew a sealed envelope. "I've written a letter," she said, "to express gratitude not just to the guard from that day, but to all of you who serve with such dedication and honor. I don't know if he's still in service or even if he would remember that day, but I wanted someone to know how much that moment of kindness meant to my family. She placed the letter at the base of the guard post, following the protocol she had researched for leaving items for guards. I became a teacher because of what I learned that day about the power of small acts of compassion. I've spent my career trying to teach children what your fellow guardsmen taught me, that kindness and strength can exist together, and that the most important moments are often the ones that aren't planned. Thomas stood perfectly still, but internally he was moved by what he was hearing. The woman's words carried a weight and sincerity that he had rarely encountered during his service. He wished he could acknowledge her somehow, but his duty required complete stillness and silence. Sarah wasn't finished. My father was a veteran, she continued, and he was struggling when we visited in 2000. Watching how your colleague handled my impulsive hug with such grace and kindness helped my father remember his own worth and dignity as a service member. In a way, that guard helped save my father's life by reminding him of the honor inherent in military service. She paused, looking up at the windows of the castle. I know you can't respond, and I'm not asking you to break protocol. I just wanted someone to know that what you do here matters in ways you might never realize. You're not just guarding a building or performing a ceremony. You're representing something important about duty, honor, and service that people like my family carry with them for the rest of their lives. As Sarah spoke these words, something extraordinary was happening inside the castle. Colonel William Harrison, now nearing retirement after 4 decades of service, happened to be walking past a window that overlooked the courtyard. He recognized the location immediately as the spot where the famous incident had occurred during his earlier command. Curious about what was happening, Colonel Harrison made his way down to the courtyard. He arrived just as Sarah was concluding her impromptu speech to Guardsman Bennett. The colonel recognized something in the woman's posture and manner that triggered a memory. "Excuse me, madam," Colonel Harrison said, approaching respectfully. "I couldn't help but overhear. Are you by any chance the young lady who visited us in the year 2000? Sarah turned, surprised to be addressed by someone in military dress. "Yes, sir. I was just 11 then, but I never forgot what happened that day." Colonel Harrison smiled, the first time in years that anyone had seen such genuine warmth from the usually stern officer. "My dear, I was the commanding officer who dealt with the aftermath of your visit. I've been hoping for 23 years that someday I might have the chance to thank you personally." Sarah was stunned. "Thank me? But I broke your rules. I caused problems for the guard." "On the contrary," the colonel replied. "What you did that day and how Guardsman Thompson responded reminded all of us why we serve. It became one of the most important teaching moments in the history of this regiment. We use the story to help new guards understand that true military bearing includes the wisdom to recognize when humanity transcends protocol." The colonel gestured toward the letter Sarah had left. "And Guardsman Thompson is still with us, though he's now Warrant Officer Thompson and serves in a training capacity. I believe he would very much like to meet with you if you're willing." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. After 23 years of wondering about the guard who had shown her such kindness, she was about to have the chance to thank him properly. 30 minutes later, Sarah found herself in a small office within Windsor Castle, a privilege that few civilians ever experience. Her hands were still shaking slightly as she waited for the meeting that had seemed impossible just an hour earlier. The room was modest but dignified, with photographs of various royal ceremonies lining the walls and a view of the courtyard where her life-changing encounter had occurred decades ago. When the door opened, Sarah looked up to see a man in his late 40s entering the room. James Thompson had aged, of course, but there was something in his bearing and his eyes that she recognized immediately. He was no longer the young guard in the red tunic and bearskin hat, but the same quiet dignity that had impressed her 11-year-old self was still clearly present. "Miss Mitchell," James said, extending his hand in greeting. "I never thought I would have the opportunity to meet you again, but I'm very glad that I have." Sarah stood and shook his hand, struggling to find words. "I can't believe you remember me. I was just a little girl who didn't know any better than to hug a guard on duty." James smiled, a warm expression that had been hidden beneath his ceremonial hat all those years ago. "Remember you?" Miss Mitchell, what happened that day changed the entire course of my military career and frankly my life. Of course I remember you. They sat down across from each other, and James continued. Colonel Harrison told me you had written a letter of gratitude, but honestly, it should be me writing letters to you. What you did that day at exactly the moment when I needed it most taught me something about service that I had never understood before. Sarah listened intently as James began to share what had happened in his life following their encounter. He told her about his brother David's recovery, how David had not only survived his injuries but had gone on to have a successful military career of his own. He described how that moment in the courtyard had helped him understand that true strength included the ability to accept and acknowledge compassion. I was carrying so much worry and fear that day, James explained. The military trains us to compartmentalize our emotions, to set aside personal concerns when duty calls. But what you showed me was that recognizing human connection isn't a weakness. It's actually a form of strength. James went on to describe how the incident had influenced his approach to training new guards. When I began working with recruits, I would tell them about the day when a little American girl taught me that our job isn't just about following protocol perfectly. It's about representing the best of what military service can be, including compassion, dignity, and human understanding. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened. I had no idea, she said softly. I just saw someone who looked sad and I wanted to help. And that, James replied, is exactly why what you did was so powerful. It wasn't calculated or planned. It was pure human instinct to offer comfort to someone in need. At 11 years old, you understood something about service and sacrifice that took me years to fully grasp. James reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small, worn photograph. I kept this, he said, showing her one of the newspaper clippings from that day. Not because I wanted to remember breaking protocol, but because I wanted to remember the moment when I learned that military service at its highest level is about protecting and honoring the goodness in ordinary people. Sarah looked at the photograph, seeing herself as a child with her arms around the guard's waist and James's white-gloved hand gently placed on her head. My father kept a copy of this too, she said. He wrote in his journal that watching you handle my hug with such kindness helped him remember his own dignity as a veteran. Your father was military? James asked. Army sergeant, Sarah replied. He was struggling with what we now know was PTSD. That trip to London was supposed to help our family heal, and in many ways, it did. Your response to my hug showed him that strength and tenderness could coexist. James was quiet for a moment, processing the full impact of what Sarah had shared. So that moment helped both of our families, he said finally. Your father found his way back to understanding his own worth, and I learned how to be a better soldier by being more human. Sarah nodded, then reached into her purse to retrieve the letter she had originally left at the guard post. I wrote this before I came here, not knowing if I would ever be able to deliver it personally. But now that we're here together, I'd like to read it to you if that's all right. James nodded and Sarah unfolded the letter. Her voice was steady but emotional as she began to read. To the guard who showed kindness to an 11-year-old girl in 2000. You probably don't remember me, but I have never forgotten you. 23 years ago I did something impulsive that broke your rules, but you responded with such grace and dignity that it changed my understanding of what strength really means. You taught me that acknowledging compassion doesn't make someone weak. It makes them complete. Because of what I learned from you that day, I became a teacher who specializes in helping children who have experienced trauma. I've spent my career trying to pass on the lesson you taught me, that small acts of kindness can have enormous impacts. My father, who was struggling with his own invisible wounds from military service, was watching when you placed your hand on my head and whispered, "Thank you." Your gentle response reminded him of his own capacity for tenderness and helped him begin his journey back to healing. I wanted you to know that your moment of compassion rippled forward through the years and touched countless other lives. Thank you for showing me that the most important rule of all is to recognize when someone needs kindness, When Sarah finished reading, both she and James were quiet for several moments. Finally, James spoke. "Miss Mitchell, Sarah, I need to tell you something. That day was one of the worst days of my military career up to that point, but it became one of the most important. What you've just read to me explains why." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where new guards were taking their positions. "I've trained hundreds of young soldiers over the years since then. I tell every one of them about the day when a little girl taught me that true military bearing includes knowing when to acknowledge the humanity in ourselves and others." James turned back to face Sarah. "But I never knew about your father, or about how that moment affected your family's healing. I never knew that you became a teacher because of what happened. I never knew that our brief encounter had created such a lasting legacy of compassion." Sarah smiled through her tears. "Neither of us knew until now, but isn't that how the most important moments work? We touch each other's lives in ways we may never fully understand." As their conversation continued, James and Sarah discovered that their connection extended far beyond that single moment in 2000. James shared that his brother David, whose medical crisis had been the source of his distress that day, had indeed made a full recovery and had gone on to serve with distinction in several international peacekeeping missions. David had eventually married and had children of his own, and James was now a beloved uncle who told his nieces and nephews about the importance of kindness and human connection. "David always said that his recovery began the day I came to visit him after your hug," James revealed. "I had been so worried and distant when I visited him before that day, but after what happened with you, I was able to sit with him and really be present. He said he could feel the difference immediately." Sarah learned that James had risen through the ranks to become one of the most respected training officers in the regiment. His approach to mentoring young guards had become legendary within the military community. He didn't just teach them about protocol and precision, he taught them about the deeper meaning of service and the importance of maintaining their humanity while upholding their duties. "Every new class of recruits hears your story," James told her. "I tell them about the day when an 11-year-old girl taught me that our greatest strength as soldiers comes not from our ability to remain unmoved, but from our wisdom in knowing when to acknowledge the goodness in others." James had never married, dedicating himself entirely to his military career, but he had found deep fulfillment in shaping the next generation of guards. Many of his former students had gone on to leadership positions throughout the British military, carrying with them the lessons they had learned about balancing discipline with compassion. Sarah, in turn, shared more details about her own journey. She had indeed become an elementary school teacher, but her specialization in trauma-informed education had led her to work with children from military families, refugees, and others who had experienced significant challenges. Her classroom had become a sanctuary where children learned that their emotions were valid, and that showing kindness was a form of strength. "I have a picture of you placing your hand on my head hanging in my classroom," Sarah told James. "Next to it is a quote I wrote: 'True strength is gentle, and true gentleness is strong.' My students always ask about the picture, and I tell them about the day a soldier taught me that the bravest thing you can do is show someone that they matter." James was amazed to learn that their encounter had influenced not just Sarah's career choice, but her entire approach to working with children. She had developed teaching methods that emphasized empathy and emotional intelligence, helping hundreds of young people understand that vulnerability and courage often went hand in hand. As their meeting neared its end, Colonel Harrison returned with an unexpected suggestion. "Given the extraordinary nature of this reunion," he said, "and the lasting impact of your original encounter, I would like to propose something unprecedented. Would you, Miss Mitchell, be willing to participate in a special ceremony tomorrow?" Sarah looked confused. "What kind of ceremony?" "We're installing a new group of guards next week," the colonel explained. "As part of their final training, I would like to have you speak to them about the importance of maintaining their humanity while serving with honor. Your story has become part of our regimental tradition. Having you there to tell it in person would be invaluable." James's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Sarah, would you consider it?" These young men and women are about to begin their service, and hearing directly from you about the impact of compassion and dignity would be incredibly meaningful to them." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the request, but also deeply honored. "I would be privileged to do that," she said, "but I'm not sure what I would say to them." "Just tell them what you told me today," James suggested. "Tell them about your father, about your career, about how a single moment of human connection can create ripples that last for decades. Tell them that their service matters in ways they may never fully understand." The next day, Sarah found herself standing before 30 young men and women who were about to begin their service as Queen's Guards. As she looked at their eager faces, she was reminded of her own students back in Ohio, young people on the verge of discovering their own capacity for making a difference in the world. 23 years ago, Sarah began. "I was an 11-year-old girl who did something impulsive that should have gotten a soldier in trouble. Instead, it began a story about the power of kindness that is still being written today." As she spoke, Sarah could see the recruits leaning forward, captivated by her words. She told them about her father's struggles, about the healing power of witnessing true strength combined with gentleness, and about how their future service would touch lives in ways they might never know. "You are about to take on roles that require incredible discipline and dedication," she continued. "But I want you to remember that your greatest strength will not come from your ability to remain unmoved by the world around you. It will come from your wisdom in knowing when a moment calls for you to acknowledge the humanity in others and in yourselves." When Sarah finished speaking, the room was silent for a moment before erupting in applause. Several of the young guards had tears in their eyes, moved by the realization that their service could have such profound meaning. After the ceremony, James walked Sarah back to the courtyard where their story had begun. "You know," he said, "that little girl who hugged me 23 years ago probably had no idea that she was changing the world. But she was, one moment of kindness at a time." Sarah smiled, looking up at the castle walls that had witnessed so much history. Maybe that's how all the most important changes happen. Not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through ordinary people choosing to be kind when kindness is needed. As Sarah prepared to return to Ohio, she carried with her not just the satisfaction of having expressed her gratitude, but the knowledge that her spontaneous act of childhood compassion had indeed created exactly the kind of lasting legacy she had hoped for. The story of the hug that broke protocol had become a story about the protocol of human kindness, one that would continue to influence military service members for generations to come. James returned to his duties with renewed purpose, knowing that the story he had been telling for over 2 decades had come full circle. The little American girl who had taught him about strength and gentleness had grown into a woman whose entire life embodied those same principles, creating her own ripples of compassion that extended far beyond a single moment in a castle courtyard. Their reunion had proven that some connections transcend time and protocol, and that the most important rules are often the unwritten ones that govern how we treat each other with dignity, respect, and love.